Well, hello everybody, colleagues around North America and New Zealand. Welcome to this webinar on medical devices regulation in Australia. My name is Arthur Brandwood. I'm the CEO and Principal Consultant of Brandwood Biomedical, a regulatory firm based in Sydney and Beijing with about coming up to 15 years operational experience in global regulatory affairs and a particular expertise in Asia Pacific. Before I begin the webinar, just a little bit of housekeeping. What you should be seeing at the moment is something like this on your screen, a webinar viewer with the front page of the slides and this little control panel here. And if you want to click the orange arrow button here, you can open up this window, and this provides a place for you to ask questions during the course of the webinar. Type them into the window where it says enter a question for staff. They'll be saved and collated, and I'll take questions at the end which anybody might want to raise during the webinar. One final thing, I'd suggest for your optimum viewing experience that you close any other browser windows or mail applications or anything else that's going to grab internet bandwidth during the course of the webinar. I wouldn't want you to disrupt the show. Okay, let's begin. The agenda for this webinar will be to look at the Australian regulatory model and understand its European origins and how that then translates into what operates here. The Australian regulatory framework is really based upon that embodied in the European Medical Device and Active Implantable Medical Devices directives and as modified by the Global Harmonization Task Force. We'll take a look at the Therapeutic Goods Administration as an agency and the legislation which it is empowered to enforce here in Australia as a regulatory system for medical devices. We'll take a look at some of the local differences that do exist. The regulatory model is very closely based on the European one, but it's not precisely the same. And there are some specific differences which are important to understand if you intend to supply devices into this market. We'll also take a look at the responsibilities of the different parties involved and particularly focus on the sponsor. That's the legal entity, the company that must be present in Australia to hold the licenses, the authorized representative for the manufacturer. And finally, we'll look at the regulatory process, how that works, how you obtain an approval based upon European certification, and we'll look at what's changing in that process and what's coming up in the next 1 to 2 years with some of the proposed regulatory reforms that are being planned. Let's begin with the regulatory model. As I've already said, the Australian model is based closely upon that of the European Union, upon the medical device directives. And that European model, just to recap for those of you who may not be fully familiar, has a number of particular elements. It has a set of essential requirements. These are broad statements in the directives which set out the high-level safety and performance requirements for medical devices that must be met. The European model allows use of consensus standards as a means of compliance. There is a rules-based risk classification which classifies medical devices according to the risks associated with their use. There is a system of regulatory intervention and oversight which is based upon the risk class, with the lowest class devices, class 1, being essentially self-declared without any external review, all the way to the class 3 devices and active implantable medical devices, which are subject to a high level of pre-market and post-market regulatory review. And there is a post-market or vigilance system for monitoring devices once they're in the marketplace. This framework was used as the basis of the Global Harmonization Task Force regulatory model. The GHTF took much of the work of the European Union and added to it and refined it and developed a whole body of guidance. And the guidance documentation and some of the primary framework documents produced by the GHTF have been adopted by the TGA, which has effectively adopted the GHTF regulatory model. The European model, as refined by the GHTF, has now become the Australian regulatory model. Turning to the agency, here's an aerial photograph of the Therapeutic Goods Administration. It's a modern building sitting on the outskirts of the national capital of Australia, Canberra. Leafy, open situation in the sheep paddocks near the olive groves just outside of the suburbs, and there's the view of Canberra in the distance. It's a division of the Commonwealth Government Department of Health, a division of our national federal government, and just a couple of observations about the organisation. This building has about a little more than 500 employees working in the agency, but less than 100 of those would be working in the medical devices area, so it has relatively limited resources for the nature of the regulatory system that's in place here in Australia. That means that the agency does struggle sometimes to meet review deadlines, particularly if there are peaks and troughs in the workloads. The TGA acts as both the competent authority and the conformity assessment body. The European system is one where those two roles are separated, where there is a national agency in each member state which acts as the competent authority, and there are a number of notified bodies which do the conformity assessment. There are no third-party notified bodies which operate in Australia. TGA is the only body that's allowed to do conformity assessment, and it also has the competent authority role for doing things like monitoring of clinical trials and monitoring of post-market regulation. And finally, this rather modern building originated as the National Biological Standards Laboratory. It started off as the National Laboratory. A number of laboratories were brought onto this one site, and out of that developed the regulatory agency. It's still got a very high proportion of its staff who are scientifically or engineering qualified, and there's a strong scientific culture. So that really has an effect on the interactions with the agency and the kinds of things that they do. They can be quite sophisticated in their review questions and quite searching, and it's really worth knowing that that can happen. Looking at the internal structure of TGA, the TGA organization separates both the pre-market and the post-market functions, and quite deliberately so, and it also tries to integrate medicines, devices and IVDs into its management structure. Here's the chart, the senior management group at the top in red, and then there are three organizational divisions within TGA: the market authorization group, the monitoring and compliance group, and the regulatory support group. The latter one provides the back office and corporate services. The market authorization group is for pre-market regulation of all types of therapeutic goods, and the monitoring and compliance group does the post-market regulation, provides the laboratory services, and provides the manufacturing audit function. So where are the medical devices within all of this? Here's the pre-market. It sits within the Office of Devices Authorization alongside its sister offices of complementary medicines and medicines authorization. And that's the group that accepts applications for a regulatory approval for medical devices in Australia. The post-market group sits within the Office of Product Review. That office has responsibility for post-market regulation, not just of medical devices and in vitro diagnostics, but also for all medicines and biologics. And I'll just back up there because I've managed to take it forward a bit. I should also comment that there is a division here. There's a sort of a metaphorical wall between these two groups. They are independently organized with different personnel, and that's quite deliberate. The TGA wants to have some level of independence between the group that approves medical devices and the group that monitors the post-market performance and the manufacturing audits. Now, looking at the legislative framework, as is the case in a number of jurisdictions around the world, we start with an act, a piece of legislation, the Therapeutic Goods Act of 1989. Below that, there are a set of subordinate regulations which contain much of the detail of the regulatory framework. And then that is supported by external documents such as guidances and methods and standards and pharmacopoeia, as well as specific orders that can be enacted by the TGA for things like exemptions of medical devices. If you want to look at this in detail, have a look at this website. All of the Act and regulations and the orders are available through the TGA website and through the external common law website of the federal government. Let's take a look at the Therapeutic Goods Act. Here's the contents page of the Act. It's split into 5 chapters, and by far the largest chapter is actually this one, Chapter 4, which covers the medical devices requirements. Within this, you'll see that are quite familiar if you're familiar with the European system. So within the Act are requirements for essential principles and use of standards and processes for conformity assessment and certification, as well as including the devices in a national register, which we'll come on to in a moment. Ordinate regulations contain most of the detail of the regulatory framework. And I'd make a point that one of the key differences in Australia is there are not separate sets of legislation for medical devices, active implantables, and in vitro diagnostics. They're all covered in the one regulatory model. How is that done? Well, it's done principally by a modification of the classification rules. There's an additional Rule 5.7 in Australia, which defines active implantable medical devices as a separate class. So an active implantable medical device is simply classified as class AIMD and regulated according to the requirements for that class. And most of the requirements are pretty much the same as for class 3 medical devices. There are also 4 new rules which define 4 classes of in vitro diagnostic devices. And again, there are further rules as to the conformity assessment procedures that apply to those different classes of IVD device. I'll draw your attention specifically to Part 5 of the regulations that contains the detail on how to include medical devices in the register. The register, or the Australian Register of Therapeutic Goods, or the ARTG, is a national database which contains details of every single kind of medical device that is approved for supply in Australia. It's the primary point of control. It is a criminal offence in Australia to supply a medical device that is not entered onto the ARTG unless there is a specific exemption for that device to be supplied without an entry. Devices are grouped within the ARTG. They're grouped as kinds of medical device. TGA has this notion of a kind of a medical device. What is a kind of medical device? It's a group of devices which share a number of common features. Those common features are that they are all made by the same manufacturer, that they are all licensed in the name of the same sponsor in Australia. That's the sponsor is the manufacturer's authorized representative. That they are all covered by the same global medical device nomenclature system code, covered by the same GMDNS code. The devices must all share a common classification, and they must all share a common intended purpose. So this grouping arrangement allows, for example, a manufacturer of say a monitoring machine or an EEG machine, where they may make several models of this device. If it's the same manufacturer, the same sponsor, they're all covered by one code for an EEG machine, they're all the same classification, and they're all the same intended purpose, then there is a need for only one single entry onto the ARTG. It also allows new models to be added if they again share those same properties, to be added later without the need for an additional application for regulatory approval. There is an exception to all of this, and that is for Class 3 and also active implantable medical devices, where there may be a single ARTG entry covering a family of devices which share the same manufacturer's sponsor GMDNS code, classification and intended purpose, but each individual model of device covered by that registration will be separately identified by a unique product identifier. So they are individually identified and traceable within the register. This provides a greater degree of flexibility to trace and, if necessary, recall individual devices within these higher risk classes. Let's just take a look at what this costs. These are the current fees and charges for applications to TGA for inclusion in the register. You can see the full range of fees and charges at the web address detailed above. They're available on the TGA website. TGA is fully cost recovered. It receives no separate budget from the federal government. Its entire operations are covered by the costs it recovers from industry in the form of fees charged on applications and on annual maintenance of entries on the register. Application fees vary according to risk class from 0, there is no fee for a Class 1 application, through a higher level of $920 for Class 1 measuring or sterile devices, 2As and 2Bs, and for the highest risk categories there's an application fee of $1,180. The annual fees vary similarly, starting at $80 for Class 1 devices, again through to $1,180 for the higher risk classes. There are also additional fees in the case of devices which are subject to mandatory application audit. The application process for some of the higher risk devices includes a desk audit of documentation at one of two levels, either level 1, which is a fairly straightforward verification of the application and the veracity of the high-level documentation, in other words, the certificate and the declaration of conformity. Level 2 audits go further than that. They require review of some of the supporting technical and clinical safety and performance data. Typically, Level 2 audits would include reviews of the risk management report, reviews of the clinical evaluation report, and perhaps some of the other more specific documentation. For those devices, and they are defined by TGA that require a mandatory application audit, those devices are subject to the relevant fee. TGA may choose to conduct an application audit on any application of any class. However, it's only the ones where there is a mandatory audit which attract fees. Any other device which is not subject to mandatory audit, but which TGA decides to conduct an audit on the particular application, there is no fee charged, although you still have to produce the information. And just for your convenience, these amounts are all in Australian dollars, and at the bottom of the screen there you can see some conversion rates to convert these into your local currency. Now let's look at device classification. The classification system in Australia is closely based upon that of the European Union. However, there are some specific differences which may affect a small subgroup of devices which end up with different classifications in Australia compared to Europe. The first of these is that Australians have larger central circulatory systems than do Europeans. The Australian definition of central circulatory system includes the common iliac arteries, which are not included in the European definition. That means that devices which come into contact with the common iliac arteries but don't progress further into the central circulatory system would normally be considered Class 2B in Europe, but they are Class 3 medical devices in Australia. It affects some devices such as aneurysm stents, which may be placed into those arteries but not further in. So those devices would be Class 3, and that may mean that you need to produce some additional evidence if you're going to obtain a medical device approval in Australia based on European approvals. Disinfectors in Australia are more rigorously classified than they are in Europe. All disinfectors, irrespective of what they disinfect, are considered to be Class 2B medical devices, whereas in Europe only disinfectors or invasive devices are Class 2B. Devices of microbial or recombinant origin, or containing materials of microbial or recombinant origin, are considered Class 3 in Australia. They are grouped with all devices which contain materials of biological or animal origin. There are a few exceptions to that of devices with low risk, things such as pharmacopoeial grade materials. All devices in contact with the central nervous system are considered Class 3 in Europe. In Australia, depending on the duration of contact, such devices may be placed into any of the classes from Class 1 through to Class 3. There are also some local differences in documentation. Australia uses the Essential Principles Checklist, essentially a copy of the guidance produced by the Global Harmonisation Task Force. The wording of that checklist and those essential principles are slightly different to the essential requirements in the annex to the Medical Device Directive. This means that if you're producing a technical file for a device which is intended to be supplied to Australia, you need to either produce a separate Essential Principles checklist or a cross-reference which shows how the existing European Essential Requirements checklist it can be used to satisfy the Australian Essential Principles and to cross-reference the different parts. For example, the Essential Principle 14, which speaks to clinical evidence requirements in the GHTF checklist, is no longer present in the Essential Requirements checklist in Europe, which in the most recent revision, that particular element became 6.2, so you need to cross-reference the different parts. We've already covered the fact that Australian classifications may be different in some cases. Some devices will be differently classified, and if you end up with a higher risk class in Australia, then you may need to produce additional evidence in order to gain a TGA approval on top of the simple CE certification. TGA is very particular about the format of its declarations of conformity. A European declaration of conformity is not acceptable to the Therapeutic Goods Administration. They require that you use their specific templates which contain additional information that's not normally found on a European declaration of conformity. They are quite particular about information such as GMDNS codes, such as covering off what standards are used, and a number of other items of information which must be present on the declaration of conformity. The declaration of conformity is almost always required to be filed with TGA as part of the application, so it's really important that you go to the website, download the right template, and use that one in addition to the European declaration of conformity that you have in your technical file. And finally, TGA has a particularly rigorous approach to clinical evaluation reports. It is not acceptable to present a report that may be prepared by, for example, a product engineer. TGA requires that clinical evaluations are either directly conducted and signed off by a clinician or are at least endorsed by a clinician following their review. So you need to have your report either written by a clinician, and that's usually difficult because clinicians are not regulatory affairs persons. They do not understand all of the nuances of what a clinical evaluation report is meant to show. So it's usually a better option to prepare the report to address the regulatory requirements and show the clinical effectiveness of the medical device, and then have that report reviewed by a clinician and have a letter of endorsement appended to the report along with the CV of that clinician, because the TGA wants to see evidence that they are appropriately qualified in a relevant clinical discipline to the use of the device. So now let's look at the broad framework of the Australian regulatory requirements in terms of which devices need to be on the register and what arrangements apply for other devices which are exempted from the register. So, firstly, there are a group of devices where there is no TGA assessment of safety, and the first and most obvious ones of those is clinical trial devices, devices supplied for the purpose of clinical trials prior to any regulatory approval. There are two pathways for gaining approvals for clinical trials in Australia. The first of those is known as the CTX pathway, the clinical trial exemption, and I mention this in passing, although it's never been used for medical devices to this point. It involves a direct TGA assessment of the protocol. It has high fees attached to the process and takes considerable time. It tends to be used by choice by the developers of high-risk medicines, and the reason for that is that it allows those developers to gain early TGA engagement with the process of clinical evaluation, get the TGA buy-in and sign-off on the clinical trial protocols, which maximizes the likelihood of acceptability of clinical data to TGA and to the current approval, the subsequent approval. The second pathway that's available is known as CTN, for clinical trial notification. This essentially devolves the entire oversight of clinical trials to the Hospital Ethics Committee. What's required under CTN is that you develop your protocol and seek Ethics Committee approval of the protocol and oversight of the trial. Once the Ethics Committee signs off on the protocol and approves the trial to commence, there is an extra piece of paper that goes with the Ethics Committee approval. There is a standard form signed off by the chairman of the Ethics Committee, which is filed with the TGA with a nominal fee of a couple of $100, and that goes to TGA as a notification only. And you can, once you've sent that to TGA, you can commence your clinical trial. To date, all device clinical trials have been done this way in Australia, and it seems likely that that's going to carry on. A second group of devices which are not subject to pre-market assessment by TGA are those which are supplied in cases of humanitarian need. That is, where there's a particular need for an unapproved medical device based on a clinical opinion from a doctor who forms the view that that particular device is necessary for the treatment of that patient. There are three pathways: SAS is A and B, Special Access Schemes A and B, and the Authorized Prescriber pathway. SAS-A is for use in cases of emergency. The Special Access Scheme A allows a clinician to use an unapproved medical device without reference to TGA and without prior approval. And then once that has happened, they can seek retrospective approval by completing the submission to TGA, and it's used in cases of emergency where there's not time to take to seek the approval. Special Access B is essentially the same process but done prospectively, where there's no immediate emergency, but there is a named patient where a particular clinician again forms a medical opinion that a particular unapproved device is necessary for treatment of that patient. They apply to TGA. There's effectively a conversation between the clinician and one of the medical officers at TGA, and the approval is usually granted. The third one is slightly more broad. It's known as Authorized Prescriber, where TGA may authorize a named clinician to use a particular type of medical device on a defined population of patients. This particular pathway is commonly used in the case of more complex and high-risk medical devices where a new model of the device or a new design may be currently undergoing regulatory review, but since design life cycles of particularly some active implantables are getting shorter and shorter, the clinicians want to get the latest technology into the marketplace. They may apply for an Authorized Prescriber exemption to use a device while the review is pending. So the review has already been lodged with TGA. The regulatory submission for the new device has been filed but not yet approved, and so a clinician may seek an Authorized Prescriber to use that device on a particularly defined population of patients. There is a rather unique and peculiar Australian exception, which is known as personal imports. The Therapeutic Goods Act provides for any person to bring into the country a personal import, either carrying it on themselves directly or to import by through the mail, a medical device or a medicine for their own personal use. One exception to this is Section 8 poisons. You can't import narcotics like this, but all other therapeutic goods can be imported for personal use at your own risk without approval from TGA. You are not, of course, allowed to supply those devices or medicines to a third party. Now let's look at devices which are subject to TGA safety and performance requirements. One group is custom-made devices, single devices individually manufactured to a clinical prescription for a named patient. A good example of those are dental crowns or orthotic braces. These types of devices must meet the safety and performance requirements of the essential principles. However, they do not require to be entered on the register. They're exempt from entry onto the register. Another group of exempt goods are very low-risk goods, such as hospital bedding, protective clothing, conventional toothpastes. These are very low-risk products where TGA can create an order exempting them from entry on the register because it really is not worth their effort to spend time reviewing them because of the very low-risk profile of these products. They are nonetheless subject to the essential principles. They must meet the essential principles, and TGA is able at any time to audit the technical files for such devices or to regulate them through processes such as recalls. So these groups of devices are not assessed by TGA. They are exempt from inclusion on the register, but they still have to meet all of the regulations for safety and performance. And finally, the group of devices that need to be registered by at the TGA, entered onto the ARTG, that is all of the conventional Class 1 through to Class 3 and active implantable medical devices, and the 4 classes of in vitro diagnostic device. These are subject to TGA regulatory assessment, which increases with the higher numbered risk class. So Class 1 devices are self-declared and are approved at the time of application. The highest risk Class 3 devices are subject to application audits, and TGA may choose to conduct an application audit on any device of any class. So let's just look at the conformity assessment model used at TGA. Essentially, it uses the same as the European system. If you're familiar with the European system, with this flowchart, which maps out the regulatory pathways for assessment available in Europe according to the different annexes of the Medical Device Directive. These particular annexes present in the Medical Device Directive have a direct mapping to the regulations in Australia. See here that for each of the annexes in the European directives, in the Medical Device Directive or the Active Implantable Directive, there is a corresponding part of Schedule 3 of the Medical Devices Regulations in Australia, which provides identical conformity assessment procedures. So TGA uses the same processes as are used in Europe, but it is the only conformity assessment body. Given the close similarity of the assessment processes and the fact that the same standards are used, TGA therefore accepts CE certificates in lieu of its own certificates for most medical devices imported into Australia. So if the device has a CE certificate, in most cases it can be approved in Australia based upon presentation of that certificate to TGA without the requirement for an additional conformity assessment process conducted in Australia. Now let's just look at the role of the sponsor in all of this. The sponsor is effectively the Australian authorised representative. Firstly, it must be an Australian legal person. It must be an Australian company. TGA requires that for all medical devices supplied in Australia, there is an Australian entity which takes responsibility for the device and which holds entries on the register. The sponsor may be a third party. It does not have to be the manufacturer, and it does not have to be the distributor. It can be a regulatory advisor such as Brandwood Biomedical, and this is a service we provide fairly regularly. There are advantages to doing it that way because it allows a manufacturer to employ a regulatory expert to conduct the dealings with the regulatory agency and to hold the license in their name. That means they are then free to establish commercial regulations with one or several distributors independently of the registration and to change those commercial arrangements according to the commercial need. The alternative of placing the registration in the hands of a single distributor means that if you do wish to change that distribution relationship, you do then require the cooperation of the distributor to hand the registration off to another alternate distributor to another party. If you don't have that cooperation, then the only alternative you have is to conduct the regulatory approvals all over again. And that can be quite a considerable time impost, as well as the additional fees and costs of doing so. Thirdly, the authorized representative, the sponsor, is responsible for providing manufacturer information to TGA on demand. If the TGA wishes to see information from the manufacturer, they will contact the sponsor and make those requests. Therefore, the TGA expects that there be a contractual arrangement with the manufacturer for supply of information. So let's look at how all of this works in practice. We have three separate entities: the manufacturer, who may be anywhere in the world, the sponsor, who must be in Australia, and the TGA, who are in the national capital of Canberra. The manufacturer, of course, holds the CE certification, which is supported by technical file data. They must determine the Australian classification of the device, and they must prepare the specific format of Australian Declaration of Conformity. The sponsor submits the CE certificate to the TGA. That is done by an electronic lodgement through the e-business portal, which is a website operated by TGA, and the CE certificate is simply lodged as a PDF copy by means of an online application form. TGA will review the CE certificate and verify its authenticity and that it is applicable to the devices which are claimed by the sponsor in the application process. Should the certificate be acceptable, then that manufacturer evidence, that certificate known as manufacturer evidence, is placed into a database of approved manufacturers with a link to that specific sponsor. That then allows the sponsor to make ARTG applications for devices within the scope of the certificate. The scope is always defined in terms of a range of GMDNS codes, and once that certificate is accepted, the manufacturer may make applications for devices which are covered by any of the GMDNS codes covered by the scope of the certificate. The sponsor then makes a second application to TGA for the particular devices, which is assessed by TGA and, if successful, results in an ARTG entry for that kind of medical device in the name of that sponsor. The sponsor is then free to arrange the supply with the manufacturer of the device in Australia. What can happen at the time of assessment is the TGA may conduct an application audit, as previously described, where they will write back to the sponsor and request technical file data and the declaration of conformity in order to make a determination as to the acceptability of the devices for supply. Now, the assumption is made at the time of the application that the manufacturer already holds the data, and the application audit comes with a formal request from TGA for information with quite a tight timeline. You have 20 days usually to provide the information, and there are no exceptions and no extensions normally granted. In other words, you cannot go off and start to generate documentation on receipt of the application audit. You're expected to hold it all in advance. There is another pathway. There is a treaty between Australia and Europe called the Australian-Europe Mutual Recognition Agreement, which provides for notified bodies in Europe to act in the shoes of the TGA and make assessments of devices which are manufactured in Europe for compliance with Australian regulations. So you can approach a notified body, ask them to conduct an assessment against TGA regulations. They issue an MRA certificate, which you then present to TGA. If it's verified, that device then is allowed to go straight onto the register without any further regulatory review, and that process typically takes between 5 days and about 2 weeks. There are some exclusions to this fast-track process, as you might call it. Devices which are Class 3 with an integral medicine must be subject to direct TGA conformity assessment. Of course, the medicine is also subject to a TGA medicines assessment, so that's a complex and long-winded and expensive process. Class 3 devices with a biological component, including recombinant products and blood products, are subject to direct TGA conformity assessment, with certain exceptions for low-risk biological products such as pharmacopoeia-grade collagens and gelatins. And thirdly, all Australian manufactured medical devices are subject to direct TGA assessment. TGA does not allow local manufacturers to use CE marks to gain direct regulatory approvals, although they do usually make a substantial abridgment of the assessment process and lower the fees for that. That really concludes the description of the process. I just want to finish with one final slide, which is a quick look into the future. Firstly, we're currently in the process of two regulatory changes. One is an up-classification of load-bearing joint prostheses, which, following the lead of Europe, have been changed from Class 2B to Class 3. The manufacturers holding Class 2B registrations for such devices have been required to submit applications for new entries at Class 3. That process is underway at the moment and comes to conclusion within the next 12 months. Secondly, the implementation of the IVD classification and requirement for IVD registrations in Australia has commenced in 2010 with a 4-year transition period which ends in 2014. The result of both of these changes is that there will be peaks of workload happening within the next 6 to 12 months as manufacturers lodge their applications for new registrations either of up-classified joint prostheses or of new IVDs. That means TGA are going to get busy. So if you're planning to bring devices to the Australian market within the next 12 months, you need to be aware of these peaks of workload, aware of the ends of these transitional periods, which is when it will get busiest of all, because there are likely to be additional delays affecting all applications going through TGA at those times. Thirdly, TGA has not been immune from the public and media and political scrutiny associated with medical device regulation that's been found all around the world. The PIP breast implant scandal, the ASR hip recall, all of these had effects in Australia, and there have been a number of government inquiries into medical device regulation in this country, and one of the things that came out of that was that the TGA was asked to increase the rigor of regulation applied to high-risk medical devices, and one of the proposals that TGA has made to do so is to introduce a third level of application audit for active implantable and Class 3 implantable devices. That application audit will call on some of the primary reports and data supporting safety and performance and clinical effectiveness, and is in effect a sort of mini conformity assessment conducted by desktop review without an audit of the manufacturer. The mutual recognition agreement has also recently been renegotiated and refined, and the devices covered are now more restricted, so that pathway has become narrower. And the big question that's on everyone's mind, and of course this will interest particularly the New Zealand participants in the webinar tonight, is the proposed formation of a new joint regulatory agency between Australia and its close neighbour New Zealand, known as the Australia and New Zealand Therapeutic Products Agency, or ANZPA. This is to be the second attempt at setting up such an agency, and it will essentially attempt to produce a joint agency which has a single regulatory pathway resulting in a single regulatory decision which is then implemented in both jurisdictions. So there'll be one agency that conducts the pre-market review and one agency which makes the regulatory approvals, and those regulatory approvals will be granted for both markets at the same time. It's going to be at least a couple of years before this is negotiated and implemented, and it promises to be some interesting times as we go through the negotiations in the future. And one particular matter that will be interesting is that New Zealand currently has no pre-market approval, pre-market review requirements. They simply have a register which is populated by notifications, and the New Zealanders are particularly in favour of the operation of third-party notified bodies, or the direct acceptance of third-party certification, which has not to this stage been acceptable to TGA, and it's going to be interesting to see where that comes out in the negotiations. So I'll conclude the webinar there and finish a photograph of one of our more interesting native wildlife, the Australian emu, which is known for its inquisitiveness and curiosity, so it's there to encourage you now to ask some questions for the last 10 or 12 minutes or so of the webinar. So at this stage, I'll look at that we've got and